Welcome to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park. Also not that too. My name's Ryan Rogers and I'm a big dumb Jurassic Park fan. Welcome to episode 70, The Inside Man, recorded August 14th, 2024. Thanks for joining me today. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E, and you can check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is Shelter Dog from Snail's second album, Charlemagne, and the outro is Centipede from his self-titled debut album, Snail. Alright, let's start with some corrections. I popped into a bookstore and had a peek at a new edition of Jurassic Park and found that the line about Deinonychus being a velociraptor is still in the text, even though I'd heard rumors that this line had been omitted. So I can confirm, at least in the 2015 Ballantine Books mass market edition, that the line is still there, although liability instead of layability hasn't been fixed, and I hate that. Dinosaur news. Alright, let's talk about two new dinosaurs from two articles, both published in the same journal on the same day. The first news story is from Scientific Reports on July 25th, called The First Deep-Snouted Tyrannosaur from Upper Cretaceous Ganzhou City of Southeastern China. The new tyrannosaur is named Asia tyrannus zhuai, and it's a small to medium-sized tyrannosaurine theropod that differs from other tyrannosauroids in possessing the following unique characteristics in the skull, and is distinctly recognized as a tyrannosaurid because of its teeth, several features in its skull, and the arctometatarsalia foot. And while its skull is about 47 centimeters long, it is noticeably, quote, deeper than other known tyrannosaurs, making this the first definitive deep-snouted tyrannosaurid from southern China and is the southernmost occurrence of tyrannosaurids in Asia. Deep-snouted seems to mean that it was short and broad, rather than long and narrow. Asia tyrannus zhuai gets its name from Asia, which refers to the continent Asia, and tyrannus, which is Latin for king or tyrant, and zhuai honors Dr. Xingzhu, making this Xingzhu's Asian tyrannosaur. It is named based on the holotype ZMNHM30360, housed at the Zhejiang Museum of Natural History. It was uncovered from the Nanxiang Formation. It's comprised of a nearly complete skull and partial disarticulated postcranial skeleton, including caudal vertebrae, right femur, tibia, and fibula, metatarsals, pedal phalanges, and a partial hind shaft of the left tibia, fibula, and metatarsals. Further interesting, the cortex of the right fibula is zonal and exhibits a minimum of 13 lines of arrested growth, commonly referred to as lags. There were a few factors that went into the author's consideration, but they believe, based on their observations, that this Asia tyrannus specimen had died at the age of about 13 years old. And as a tyrannosaurine, it would have had serrated teeth, strong jaw muscles, very small arms bearing only 2 functional digits, and an S-shaped neck, long heavy tail to balance its big head and torso, and it would have put its center of mass over its hips. The specimen would have been about 12 feet long in life, but take note it was barely a teenager still. In our second news story, it's also from Scientific Reports, also on July 25th, 2024, called Early Cretaceous Troodontine Troodontid from the Oyamashimo Formation of Japan, reveals the early evolution of Troodontinae. This new troodontid theropod specimen from Inner Mongolia, China, clarifies phylogenetic relationships of later diverging small-bodied troodontids and perivium body size evolution, says the authors. Named Hypnovenator Matsubara a Tohiorum. It is described based on an articulated postcranial skeleton recovered from the fluvial deposits of the Albian Oyamashimo Formation in Japan. The authors ran the phylogenetic analysis machine and identified Hypnovenator as, quote, the oldest and one of the most basal troodontines, forming a clade with Gobivenator mongoliensis. And let it be known, this is from the Albian age of the early Cretaceous. The Hypnovenator was found in a somewhat sleeping position, which lends to its name Hypno, which is Greek for sleep, and Venator, which is Latin for hunter, and that confusing last name there, it's Matsubara, E.T. Hoiorum, which honors Mrs. Kaoru Matsubara, that's the first part of them, and the E means also, and Takaharu is the T, and Oi is O-H-E, which is the last name of Takaharu Ois, and then the UM means that it's plural. There's 2 people there who discovered the specimen, making this Mrs. Matsubara and T. Oi's sleeping hunter. What a mouthful that last name is for me to say. Matsubara Iti Ohiorum. The holotype MNHAHD1033340, housed at the Museum of Nature and Human Activities, was uncovered from the Oyamashimo Formation. It's comprised of 2 caudal vertebrae, 2 dorsal ribs, 38 gastralia, a chevron, left humerus, left radius, left ulna, and then loads of carpals, metacarpals, ankle pieces, tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. Quote, the discovery of hypnovenators suggests that small-bodied Maniraptorans with a sleeping posture were common not only in environments with volcanic and aeolian events or alluvial systems, but also in fluvial systems. More interesting, too, is that all those foot elements help give a very detailed look at this early troodontid's foot shape, and the feet of Hypnovenator, quote, exhibit considerable morphological variation, but are functionally similar. Geometric morphometric analysis of manual ungual phalanges shows that manual ungual phalanges 1 and 3 of Hypnovenator exhibit considerable morphological variation, but are functionally similar, which differs from those of other non-troodontine troodontids, reflecting the transition of manual motion within troodontinae. In other words, Hypnovenator represents an early diverging member of the troodontids, showing in what ways troodontids began to evolve into the later known species further up the evolutionary line. Hypnovenator's feet show that, quote, asymmetrical arctometatarsis occurred by the Albion, and some morphological changes such as a shorter digit 4 and digit 3 and non-ungual phalanges of digits 3 with roller joints and digit 4 with weakly ginglymoid articulation. Ginglymoid? Oh, that's a tough one too. Arose during the early late Cretaceous. This indicates that Hypnovenator was evolving towards the, quote, arctometatarsallian condition that is linked to the cursorality of troodontines, supported by the weight-bearing function and the relative length of the hind limbs. Troodontids were evolving to become agile runners, but Hypnovenator was only on the early steps towards that journey, is what they're saying. There's a lot of truly precise paleontological language that describes the toe bones perfectly, and they appear to indicate that Hypnovenator was also developing features which would make its rear claws terrific for grasping, and its later ancestors would benefit from these improvements, and even be better at grasping in a few millennia. The mosaic features in the pes for grasping and cursorality in basal troodontines suggest the Hypnovenator, along with Gobivenator, serves as a pivotal taxon supporting a transition towards more efficient cursorial locomotion in derived troodontines, the authors summarize. All right, with the corrections and the dinosaur news out of our way, please let me introduce you to my special guest this episode. All right, I'm very pleased to welcome the London Natural History Museum Earth Sciences Merit Researcher, Dr. Paul Barrett, to the show. Dr. Barrett's major research interest centers on the evolutionary paleobiology of dinosaurs and other extinct amniotes, and he's involved in projects investigating macroevolutionary mechanisms, the evolution of Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystems, potential biases in the fossil record. Dr. Barrett, thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, well, this is excellent. So people won't know this, but Dr. Barrett and I met in the plot of a soap opera where our long-lost and gravely estranged quadruplet brothers shook free of their amnesia and began conspiring with our most beloved colleagues to launch a hostile takeover of the carefully guarded letters of incorporation to the family business, leading to a tremendous amount of drama. But what our scheming quadruplets don't know is that, Dr. Barrett, you and I have the true birth certificates which reveal we are not related in any way. So it's working out in our favor.
Yeah, it's going to be fine. It created hell with all of those kinds of claims over who was going to divide that fortune. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that works out in the end.
It turns out we're not heirs to the fortune in any way. So
yeah, so I mean, screw those guys. I mean, we're not getting any money from them.
Yes. So Dr. Barrett has joined the show today to specifically relate some details about a new paper from earlier this year on a new dinosaur that he and his co-authors described and named, I'll try my best at it, the Musankwa sanyatiensis. How did I do? Close?
Very close.
Okay. How do you...
It's more or less how it's spelled. So Musankwa sanyatiensis.
Sanyatiensis. All right. And yeah, terrific. I'm so glad you had some time to talk with me about this. So here's the truth. I wasn't exactly sure where to even start about asking about this dinosaur, but I thought maybe we'll start in an unusual place. Please let me, I guess, ask about the paper, literally itself. It's called A New Late Triassic Sauropodomorph Dinosaur from the Mid-Zambezi Basin in Zimbabwe. It's published in the Acta Paleontologica Polonica. How does a team of authors decide in which journal you would like to publish?
It comes down to various things. So there are a bunch of journals a lot of different scientists read, and they tend to be the journals where the kind of biggest, most transformational papers go because they're of interest to the biggest possible audiences. So things that are really kind of game-changing tends to go to a small number of journals, things like famous journals like Nature and Science. A large number of scientists will be aware of them and lots of people will see them. And then there are a whole range of journals that cater to a bunch of specialist subject areas. And so obviously paleontology has its own specialist journals as well. And then within the whole range of journals that are available, you have a lot of choices. You might want a journal that specializes in a particular region or a particular time, or a journal that you know has a particular readership that will be particularly interested in what you want to say. And sometimes you make other choices to do with things like how long a paper will a journal take. Some journals only take little papers, some papers will take huge kind of monographs. Will they give me free color? Will they make the paper freely available? And all of those kinds of things factor into those decisions. So the reason we picked this particular journal for this paper was, first of all, the length was about right. It's a journal that lots of paleontologists read and are familiar with, so the result would get out quite quickly. And also they have a nice access model, so all of the papers that get published in this journal are freely available to anyone to download. And because we're publishing a paper on a part of the world that isn't particularly well supported economically, and we wanted people back in Zimbabwe, if they wanted to download the paper for free, this seemed like a great place to publish it.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah. And I had to look it up. I've seen a couple papers from this journal, and I thought it was like South American or something like that. But of course, they tricked me without sneaking any, Zs and Ys and Ks. I did not realize that it was the academic paleontological papers of Poland.
That's absolutely right. So it's actually a journal that is published by the Polish Academy of Sciences. So, and it's a journal that actually has quite a long and good history with dinosaurs as well. So there are two journals, Acta Paleontologica Polonica and Paleontologica Polonica, published by the same institute. And actually the huge monographs on the very famous dinosaurs from the Gobi Desert were first published in this journal. So the kind of big descriptions of lots of new types of dinosaurs that were found by the Polish expeditions in the 1960s and 70s actually were brought to life in those journals.
Oh, so it's got a long tradition of
absolutely
of being on the front edge. That's great. So the title, a new late Triassic sauropodomorph dinosaur, is self-explanatory. Did the editors of the journal create the titles, or do you provide, or is there like a style guide that you want to fit when making sure that the consistent titling from paper to paper?
We come up with titles, but there are a few rules. So there's usually a rule over length. So you can't have a title that's kind of several paragraphs long in general. And also they will usually like the title to refer to the place the fossil is from and the age of it and the name of it. So you have to try and get those things in. And then anything else that's interesting about it, say it has some interesting biological feature or it's the first one from a particular place, you can work those in as well. But there's usually a sort of certain basic information they like in a title, so that when people are searching on a subject in a search engine, suddenly it's easier to find that information rather than giving it some obscure title or a comedy title where it might be fun, but no one might ever find the paper.
Sold my left leg to get in the Acta Polonica. Wouldn't work. So the fossil itself, as we get started, perhaps we can start with the beginning of the provenance of the fossils. I see the holotype is MHMZ2521. The name is the Sanyati Basin of the Lake Kariba in the nation of Zimbabwe. And there are some notes that these remains were excavated during two field seasons in 2017 and 2018. What time of year were they being excavated? How did you become privy to the locality? Things like that. What is the provenance of the fossils? Is there much of a story behind those?
So Zimbabwe is an amazing country. It has a lot of rocks of late Triassic and early Jurassic age. And these are rocks that we now know have lots of dinosaur fossils in. And actually a bunch of Zimbabwean-based paleontologists knew this. And there were a number of people working there in the 1970s. And they collected a bunch of fossils, partly from this region, but from other regions of Zimbabwe too, described them, and so we knew they were there. But when these Zimbabwean paleontologists retired, they were never replaced. And because of the political situation in Zimbabwe, a large number of people also left. It was difficult for people to go in for a while. And as a result, there was very little work being done on the fossils of Zimbabwe for the last 50 years. And this is actually a real shame because those rocks are really productive. It's a lovely country in which to work. It's very beautiful, and the people are very friendly and very welcoming. But for various reasons, there was just no work done. And it turns out that a bunch of amateur paleontologists in Zimbabwe have been keeping the flame burning for dinosaurs and been looking for their remains, and they've had some success. They found footprints and they found some bones here and there. And eventually, word of new finds in this area started filtering through to colleagues of mine in South Africa, because there's a very good gossip network between South Africa and Zimbabwe and Zambia and all of these countries in Southern Africa. There's a lot of good connections between them. And as a result, this news came that maybe this would be an area worth going to have a look at. So a colleague of mine in South Africa, Professor Jonas Shonyer, decided that it would be worth going out there to have a look. And so with a bunch of help from various people based in Zimbabwe, he organized these 2 expeditions to the shoreline of Lake Kariba, which happened in January 2017 and March 2018. So early in the year, both of those years. And it's a beautiful area. Strongly recommend a visit if you can ever make it. And this is an area that largely hadn't been looked at systematically for fossils for well over 5 decades. So was really an exciting opportunity to go somewhere where we knew there should be things, but that no one had been to look for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And I think there was some mention of bioturbation, and there were other specimens that were, or remains of other things. It wasn't just dinosaurs that you wound up identifying while you're out there, although they don't always make the paper. Were there more papers forthcoming, or what other interesting things were in the matrix when you were investigating?
Oh, so we did a lot of different things when we were there. We had a crew of people with lots of different experience. So we had people who were experts on the local geology. We had people that were experts in the stratigraphy, the dating of the rocks. And we also had with us people who obviously knew about dinosaurs and various other fossils that were there. So while we were there, we actually found not only this particular dinosaur, but we also found a fossil lungfish, lots of fossil lungfish teeth, and actually we just named that in a paper that came out a month ago. So there's a new type of lungfish that we announced from those beds as well. We also found evidence of a very weird crocodile-like animal called a phytosaur. And phytosaurs look superficially like crocs, but are not particularly closely related to them. But they were very common in the late Triassic in places like the US and Germany and various other places, and Morocco. But this is the first one that had been found from southern Africa. So we also were able to add that to the list. And then we did a lot of basic work on the geology, working out how the different layers of rock were stacked up and how they related to each other in the different places we went to, and some work to work out exactly how old they were. So we did a lot of different jobs while we were there. And we also have a couple of other dinosaurs that are still under wraps that we're still working on, that we think also at least one of those might be something new as well.
Interesting.
So we're in the middle of trying to work out exactly what that critter is at the moment.
I imagine the remains are not always easy to interpret. Sometimes they come up very...
No, they're not, which is why it sometimes takes a while. We were very lucky in the case of the one we're talking about today, Musankwa, because there's not very much of it, sadly. It's a shame that there's not more of it. It's a single leg. So it's a thigh bone, a shin bone, and a little bit of the ankle. But luckily it's distinctive enough from all of the other related dinosaurs that we feel it deserves a name. But this was one that was literally weathering out naturally on the shoreline. And although I've been on a lot of field trips, I am terrible at finding fossils. I'm happy to admit this. I'm quite good I have the patience to sit and excavate something. But I am really bad at spotting small signs of fossils half buried in the floor. But this one was so obvious, even I saw it. Like, I was actually the person that found it, because most of it was actually showing as a bent up, curled up leg sitting on the surface of the shoreline. And so I was just lucky that I was the person that was first in the line to spot it. But otherwise, I'm pretty bad at finding fossils. So this is one of the very few fossils that I've actually just found and then gone on to describe. Normally I end up describing things that other people have found. So it's quite a nice one for me, but I have to admit it was an easy one. It's one of those ones that actually I would have ended up probably tripping over because it was so obviously on the surface.
That's what happens when you stick your leg out like that, though.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a fun story, I guess, behind the naming, the etymology behind the name of this new dinosaur. It must be. Is it a rare and privileged position to be in, to be able to name a dinosaur? Does that happen often in one's career through a vertebrate paleontology?
It varies a bit. So a surprising number of new dinosaurs get named each year. It's usually about 50 or 60 new dinosaurs named each year from around the world. And that's a combination of people going out and digging up new dinosaurs from different places. But it's also people going to museums, opening cabinets and seeing something that hasn't been looked at properly in a number of years and realizing it's different or that the label's wrong. So it's there are a few that come up each year. And I've been lucky. In the course of my career, I've named 10 or 12 new different types of dinosaurs so far. So it's something most dinosaur people will eventually get to do, at least once. But again, it depends on what you work on. So it's basically the people who describe bones that end up naming things, whereas the people who do kind of more interesting kind of evolutionary things or looking at the biology of dinosaurs name them less because they spend less time doing the initial documentation of the bones to work out which one's which. But most people eventually who work on dinosaurs will probably find their name on a paper that names one at some point in their career. So it doesn't happen every day, but it's not unusual. And
in terms of the name for this critter, sanyatiensis obviously refers to the basin in which it was found, but Musankwa sounds like it comes from a wonderful little spot. Maybe you could describe what the inspiration was to name the animal Musankwa.
So we wanted to name it using one of the local languages that's spoken widely in the region. So it's the main language Shona that's spoken in that part of Zimbabwe. And Musankwa is the name of the boat that we were using. So in order to explore these places along the lake, all the places we're looking at are within a national park called the Matusadona National Park. And because it's a national park, we're not allowed to camp there because there are wild animals there. We were often working alongside hippos and elephants and various other things.
Wow.
And as a result, it's too dangerous to camp there overnight without armed guards. And also, I think just from a conservation point of view, they want to limit the human presence in those places, so it's not too bad. So the easiest solution to that was to hire a houseboat. Because Lake Kariba is a really large artificial lake, actually. It's actually, I think, the largest artificial lake in the world. And it was created by the damming of the Zambezi River to create hydroelectric power for Zambia and Zimbabwe. And because of this huge lake, a tourism industry developed there with these amazing houseboats that people would hire to go fishing or just to go vacationing on the water. And so we were lucky enough to have a contact in Zimbabwe who owned a tourism company that had one of these boats. So we went to him. He was able to arrange for us to use one for a couple of weeks each year. And we basically used it as a kind of floating hotel come floating laboratory. And we'd take it around and we'd station it at different points of the shore. And then the boat had a number of little launches that we would then take in to be able to walk around the lake edges and a little bit further into the park. And so we basically would move around every other day to a slightly different place to have a look. And because we spent so much time on the boat, and because the boat was run by 4 crewmen that looked after us, they cooked all their meals, they looked after our safety, they got the boat moving around, they drove the little boats to get us ashore. We thought it was only right that the boat got commemorated in some way to say thank you for all the... Because we wouldn't have been able to do the work without it.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
So I think it's the first dinosaur named after a boat. So I think that might hold some kind of really specialist world record as being like first dinosaur ever named after a boat.
I looked into it.
I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it is.
So I've seen
then sanyatiensis just refers to the local river that runs into the lake very close to the island where the bones were found.
So I've seen a couple different interpretations of the term. One is boy close to marriage.
Yeah.
What another here says maybe it means big boy, and
that's right. So the boat owner thinks it just means big boy and thinks it relates to the fact that it's a nice big roomy boat. But when speaking to our Shona-speaking colleagues, apparently it's a slightly more formal term. It's basically referring to like an older adolescent boy, like a boy who is on the verge of becoming a man, and in that kind of society, that means the point at which they're getting ready to get married.
Yeah, I interpreted it as eligible bachelor.
Exactly. So it's not big boy in terms of like some huge hulking person. It's big boy in terms of someone who is not really a boy anymore, but on the verge of adulthood.
Right on. Because it's a rental unit and this is a tourism company, I was able to look it up. And I haven't found any interesting... I found a couple neat videos of people like putting around in it, and it looks awesome. It says here...
It mainly gets used for fishing trips. There's apparently some really impressive game fish in the lake that people like to go and battle with.
It says here, it sleeps comfortably 27 passengers, but is licensed to carry 50. I presume that you guys had less than 27, maybe.
There was still a few of us. I think, including the crew, there were about 20 of us altogether on one of the trips, a couple less the other trip. But yeah, it's really kind of, so what we used to do was, although it has bedrooms and things like this down below, we used to mainly sleep, because it's so warm, average daytime temperature there's about 40 degrees C, it's 100% humidity, it's quite difficult to like get to sleep. So we used to sleep out on deck, actually, on the top of the boat each night under a tarpaulin, just so that we could get cool enough to go to sleep. So up on the decks under a mozzie net. And then every night at about 2 a.m., there would be a massive and impressive thunderstorm. Every night without fail. And actually, we all waited for the thunderstorm, because as soon as the thunderstorm happened, the humidity would suddenly drop.
Okay.
And we'd all just feel that sense of relief, and you'd just hear everyone kind of sigh and immediately fall asleep at that point until we were woken up by the sun the next morning.
That's fascinating.
But yeah. We spent a lot of time on the boat, and it also became, as I said, as well as the place we were staying, it was where we were storing the fossils, where we'd do all the planning for the work. So it was a really key part. And it kept us safe. Kariba has the highest incidence of crocodile-related deaths in Africa.
Oh, dear.
So there are a lot of crocs in the water, so you don't go near the water very much. You stay well away from the edge. We saw quite a few crocs, but... touch wood, none of us got too close to a croc, so it was all fine.
That's fascinating. So you don't have to be prepared for this, but I looked into famous boats and other dinosaurs that may have been named after boats, and there aren't a lot directly related, but I dug around and found some other dinosaurs that might have been named after boats. First of all, this is kind of indirect, all the titanosaurs would have been named after the Titanic, which, or not the Titanic, but the Titanic and the Titanosaurs would have both been named after the Titans, so that's... They're sharing a name, provenance.
Yeah, there's a common root. Common root there.
So there was that, and then of course, if the Titans count as being somewhat related between that, then Poseidon was also count, and so there was the SS Poseidon, which was a film back in '72 with Gene Hackman.
It's a Poseidon. Yeah, in the UK, that was called the Poseidon Adventure. That movie. Yeah, famous disaster movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it has to be famous with Gene Hackman. So anything with Poseidon, like the sauropodomorph, would have borrow a name from a common root that also that ship did. The only other boat dinosaur combo that came up, this is kind of a nefarious one, but the Viavinator Exxoni derives its name from Exxon Mobil, the company which funded the fieldwork leading to the discovering of Viavinator, but it also bears the name of the Exxon Valdez, of course, which was famous for all the wrong reasons back in the age of the novel Jurassic Park 1989. So you might remember that little news story.
Yeah, that was a famous one. Not one that they're probably keen on being repeated over and over again.
And I'll leave it at that, yeah. But I checked other famous ships like the Queen Anne, no dinosaurs. The SS Minnow, no dinosaurs. HMS Beagle, Mayflower, Flying Dutchman, Red October, the Venture. I couldn't find nobody's got to name dinosaurs after them.
No, I'm pretty sure we might be the first one, actually. First one named specifically after a specific boat.
This is unfair because... now, of course, if you think about avian dinosaurs, then you do find a couple animals that were named after boats. There's the frigate bird.
That makes sense, sure.
Which is named after a warship. And the boat-tailed grackle. There's a black-breasted and yellow-breasted boat bill. Apparently they have boat bills. There's a couple herons and things like that. And the last one here I found was Howard Hughes' spruce goose, which was a flying boat. In the 1940s.
I bet there's probably something with a canoe in there. I bet there's a bird with like some canoe-shaped beak or something like that. I bet there's one.
Yeah, well, maybe a whippoorwill is a boat. I don't know.
Could well be.
But I think the spruce goose technically flew once. So that counts too as a...
No, it's a weird thing naming something. I mean, when we're naming things, we're trying to find some odd feature of the animal that stands out, or we're looking want to commemorate, say, the place it's from or the time it's from. And sometimes we're commemorating a person, like particularly the person who found it, or someone that as sort of a lifetime achievement kind of recognition thing. So yeah, in this one though, we thought we'd go with the place, sort of rather traditionally for the species, but we thought the other one was a bit more interesting to go with the boat.
All right, so you're very brave to go out on a boat which has the word "sank" right in it. So good for you guys.
I have to admit that hadn't occurred to us.
No. Let's get on the Musankwa.
We'd have had to come up with all sorts of rituals otherwise, I guess, to make sure that we didn't jinx it any further. Yeah.
So I guess one of the things I like to do with this show is to try and relate real dinosaur stuff into what was presented in the novel Jurassic Park. Obviously, they have in the book and in the film they portray a trailer, and so I was wondering maybe the trailer and the boat will have some common features. The paper describes the boat like a home and mobile laboratory during 2 field expeditions. In the novel, when they have a trailer in Montana, see how the boat measures up to this. In Montana, their trailer was air-conditioned, filled with a series of long wooden tables with tiny bone specimens neatly laid out, and they were tagged and labeled, and there were ceramic dishes and crocks which emanated the strong odor of vinegar. And they had a beer-filled refrigerator, a pile of discarded rocks that were too fragmentary for use, and a torn couch, sagging chair, and battered end table. In the book,
we did somewhat better than that. So we had air conditioning.
That's good,
but only for a couple of hours every day because it ran the engines down too much. So usually in the middle of the day when it was hottest and we had to retreat to the boat rather than work, we had a couple of hours of air conditioning then, but no more than a couple of hours. All the sofas were in very good condition on the boat. They weren't tattered at all, and we did have a fridge filled with beer. We also had a reasonable amount of wine and other things as well on the boat, so that's another similarity. We did not have rows of neatly laid out specimens. We had a lot of untidily rows of specimens laid out because we're dealing with, I don't know what they had in that little trailer, but they must have been tiny. I mean, we were dealing with fairly big lumps of rock, so we had rock piles dotted around that were representing different things that we'd excavated and plaster jackets. But yeah, some crossover there. So the air conditioning is crossover, the beer is a crossover, but I'd say we were better served with sofas. We definitely had a lot of comfort sofas, but we're probably less tidy. I think that would be fair to say.
Well, in terms of small specimens, I know that they were excavating or had discovered in the ground a juvenile velociraptor in Montana, but they'd found it, and it was, they're saying that the claw was just the size of a rose thorn. So the fossils they were excavating were not big. They were primarily juveniles.
We didn't really see any small stuff, unfortunately. We weren't well equipped to look for small stuff because you often need things like sieves and so on to go through very fine grades of rock to look for really small things. So most of the things we found were fairly chunky, fairly big. We did find a lot of isolated teeth of things.
Right on.
So they were probably the smallest things we were finding, but we didn't find any evidence of really dinky animals like either small dinosaurs or things like lizard-sized animals or tiny mammals. We just didn't see any of those, unfortunately.
It sounds like the enamel on teeth helps them endure, but anything else that's small doesn't have enamel. And it doesn't...
Teeth are really durable. And obviously the other thing with reptile teeth is that reptiles make teeth all through their lives.
Yeah.
So it's not like us where we're limited to 2 sets of teeth and then we lose our second set of teeth when we get really old and turn into like gummy monsters. But those kinds of animals actually making teeth all the time they're alive, so they're very common. And because the teeth are being lost as they get ripped out through use, through chewing, or through getting hooked in prey or whatever, they're very common fossils. And because enamel is the hardest substance actually made by any living thing, effectively, it's really durable and it lasts. And the other good thing about enamel is it often makes the fossils slightly shiny. And when you're walking along and you're trying to spot fossils on a surface, those little glints of light among the rest of the rocks sometimes give you a clue that there's something resting there that makes it a bit easier to spot.
Yeah, that's wild. Well, I had questions about the island and the lake and stuff like that. You kind of have touched on some of the wildlife that you saw. I've heard sometimes you got to take a special shot before you go to Africa because the insects can give you things. What kind of prep goes into before you go out there?
It depends. I mean, it really depends where you are. So actually, where we were is very remote. The nearest town is about 50 kilometers away, so we have to make sure we had a decent first aid kit for anything going wrong, and a little bit of first aid training to deal with the sorts of minor injuries that you pick up when you're out all day walking and you're occasionally hitting things with a chisel and a hammer, those kinds of things. In terms of health, actually the biggest problem is dehydration.
Sure.
Because it's so warm, you're walking around carrying things, it's hot all day, it's very humid, so you're sweating a lot, you're losing a lot of water, and a lot of salt and a lot of sugar. So actually making sure you're drinking a lot to avoid heat stroke and sunstroke were probably the most serious things. And several people did get mild heat stroke while we were there and would be out of action for a day or two while they rehydrated, basically, and got a bit better. And so that's actually the biggest single thing, because although there are lots of wild animals there, we're not stupid enough to go up to them and try and pet them or to get really close to them. And we also had a very experienced game ranger with us, who was actually the amateur paleontologist Steve Edwards, who was finding things in this area to start with. So he was with us all the time with his trusty rifle in case anything decided to come a bit too close. And then the other big thing we had to worry about were mosquitoes. Because there are malarial mosquitoes in the area, so being constantly covered in DEET the whole time we're there, or being under a mozzie net, because there were lots of mozzies. So, but luckily, no. Although lots of us got bitten, because we're all on malaria prophylaxis as well. None of us actually picked anything up, but that and dehydration are probably the two most serious health issues we faced. And we're lucky we're not there working in a part of Africa where there are particularly nasty things like yellow fever or things like that. So we're vaccinated for basic stuff, things like tetanus, which you can pick up from just a dirty wound if you accidentally cut yourself with a chisel or something like that. But we're lucky we didn't have to be too worried about particularly nasty things other than malaria, which is very widespread everywhere in the tropics. So we're well prepared for that.
Exciting all the same. But yeah, it sounds like seeing wild animals and stuff would be just fascinating. I guess crocodiles out in the wild in the middle of, not quite in civilization, that it'd be kind of daunting to see them, knowing that they could be real trouble.
I mean, I'm really lucky. I'm in my regular private life. One of my preferred ways of going on vacation is actually to take a safari. So when I'm doing field work in a number of these places, I'm lucky enough to sometimes tack on a little bit of extra time for a vacation. And often when I'm in that part of the world, it involved going and doing some wildlife spotting. So I've been out in some fairly wild places in a fairly unprotected ways with lots of different kinds of wildlife. So I've had some experience in being in those kinds of environments before, but it never ceases to give you a bit of a thrill. You see an elephant on the other side of a river bank and you think, if it really wanted to be, it could be across that river pretty fast. So maybe we'll just back off and give it some room. And although wanting to get a nice tourist shot of it at the same time, you have to be sensible in those situations. Realize that you're living in the place that they live. You have to give them the space. They don't move for you. You get out of their way. But it was terrific. So in addition to the things we mentioned, we'd see a lot of sort of small antelope as well off in the distance, although they're a lot shyer, so we generally see them from further away. And lots of birds, like for people who like bird watching, there are hundreds of different species of birds swooping around the edges of the lake and over the lake. So, and just naturally very beautiful. Lots of really beautiful mountains forming the edges of the lake. And the other thing I've never seen anywhere else, a weather thing, was I actually saw my first water spout on the lake as well. I've never seen a water spout before. And that was really quite impressive.
Were it like geysers up, or what is a...
Right, but basically like a small tornado, but over the lake, so sucking water up.
Right. Okay.
So actually, really, I've never seen one before in reality, and it's really impressive. And at night, because we're so far from permanent human settlement, it's totally dark as well. So we could be up on the top deck of the boat, having a post-dinner beer, and the sky is just filled with stars. So in a way that you never see in a built-up part of Europe or North America, just completely dark. And so every night we just sit there and get a couple of our local colleagues, very good astronomers, and we get a quick astronomy lesson in the constellations above us and see a few shooting stars going overhead and things like that. So it's a really nice way to cool down at the end of the day, just to do a little bit of stargazing too.
What are the wild noises at night like way out there?
Not many, basically insect noises, because most of the animals weren't coming particularly close to the boat. You'd occasionally hear sounds of hippo and thing in the water, and elephants in the water going, like, crossing water. But in general, it's not like it's not some kind of terrifying thing where there are constant cries of blood-curdling animals nearby. So pretty quiet, other than the kind of sounds of chirpings of insects and frogs and things like that.
That's very nice. So I wanted to ask about the rock formation from which the fossil was found. I know you mentioned that you were able to publish on a lungfish that you also found there. You may, if I'm reading this correctly, may have also helped co-author a paper in 2021, maybe called Sedimentology and Paleontology of the Upper Karoo Group in the Mid-Zambezi Basin, Zimbabwe, New Localities and Their Implications for Interbasinal Correlation. I didn't really read the whole thing, but it appears that it looks like there's a lot of other co-authors that you worked with on the dinosaur paper on this one as well. You were mentioning how you had a lot of opportunity to investigate the sediments and things like that. And from the abstract, it sounds like you're able to clarify maybe the aging or the date of the rocks that hadn't been done, you said, in like 50 years. So I was just curious, like when we talk about the rock formation from which it was found and learning a bit more about the environment, how more in a clearer focus might you be able to envision the land of Musankwa back then?
So we didn't really have a good idea of how old these rocks were. They could have been anything from about 237 to about 180 million years old. Because the only real dates that we have on them are actually rocks that overlie these. There's a bunch of lavas that were formed by a set of big volcanic eruptions that kind of form the top of this rock sequence. And because they're made of lava and they have a number of rock minerals in them that we can use for dating, we have kind of a date for the top, if you like. But all of the rocks underneath don't have any lavas in. They don't have any kind of useful fossils in them that are usually used for dating. And so there were a lot of question marks over the ages of a lot of these rocks. And we were lucky enough to, first of all, work out how these different layers related to each other along the shores of the lake. So what order they came in and how they related to each other at different sites, by looking at the features of the sediments themselves and comparing the different rock types and the sorts of the grain sizes of the rocks, how they were stacked, whether they'd been laid down by rivers, whether they'd been in a pond, whether they were old soils, these kinds of features. But we were also able to get an actual date out of it as well, because we were able to find a few mineral grains in a couple of the samples we took that we were able to get a hard date based on what we call radiometric dating, which is where we use radioactive isotopes to come up with an age. And that age is from a set of rocks very close to where Musankwa comes from. And that age was 210 million years, which sticks it bang in the middle of the Late Triassic period. So we're dealing with something about the same age as the classic kind of dinosaur sites from Central Europe, where we get Plateosaurus, and those in South America, where we get a number of other early dinosaurs, and most importantly for us, a bunch of Southern African early dinosaur sites. So it's the same age as a bunch of the sites just across the border in South Africa, which meant that it gives us a direct point of comparison between those two places.
Mm-hmm. That's great in terms of, I know you were saying that the authors were resistant on going so far as to say that there is enough here to maybe classify a new family, but there's potential to suggest that the similarities between what is being found in Zimbabwe is indicating that they're distinct enough from what you'll find in Europe or even in South Africa that you might find like a little clade of things maybe there in Zimbabwe, which is kind of fun.
Well, there's a hint that this animal in particular is quite closely related to one from South Africa called Unimisaurus and another one from South America called Rheocosaurus. And those animals, in our evolutionary analysis, they often come out together in a group. They don't always, but they do sometimes. They're pretty similar. And they're all the same age. They're all about 210 million years old in each of these different places. So it seems like it's possible there is like a little family of these animals that were alive at about the same time, that had maybe this very wide African, South American distribution. And of course, at the time, Africa and South America are right next to each other. They're still physically joined to each other at this time in Earth history. So maybe it was possible for the ancestors of these animals to move back and forwards between these two areas at some point.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think. We know that Pangaea is like this famous supercontinent, but I think that it begins to drift pretty early in the Mesozoic. Are they by the Late Triassic, or right in the middle of that Late Triassic era? Is there still a connectivity? Like, would they still have a geographic connectivity that they could, as a species, have existed and over millions of years they get around?
They're certainly connected down south. So things like South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, India are all still intimately joined during the Late Triassic. But what is happening is we are starting to get the initial breakup of Pangaea. So we're starting to get a crack developing, if you like. So what happens is we get the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean. And that starts to push apart North America from Europe and from Africa on one side, and it starts to gradually open up. So it's the initial stages of breaking up that Pangaean supercontinent start to happen in the Late Triassic. But it doesn't happen down south. It's something that starts up north to start with, breaking those things apart. But it's not too long before we start to see the separation between the northern and southern continents into what we call Laurasia, with Eurasia and North America in the north and all the other continents in the south, which are still combined in this huge single landmass called Gondwana. And so even into the Jurassic, we still have these two big super landmasses with the opportunities for swapping between them. But we do start to get a north-south separation in the Jurassic. And in the Late Triassic, we're just starting to see the first signs of that with this opening up of the North Atlantic Ocean, which opens a lot earlier than the South Atlantic. That comes not until the Cretaceous period, much, much later.
I think one of the things in the paper that it was commenting on in terms of sauropodomorphs was that a lot of the specimens that have been described historically are from isolated fragments to semi-complete articulated sauropodomorphs, but also that in a lot of respects they were kind of collectively just described as mesospondylus and not really looked at too much more closely in terms of maybe they were distinct species. And so as people begin to pick them apart and notice the differences, it is suggesting that there is a greater diversity in sauropodomorphs in the area. What does it mean to have a higher diversity of dinosaurs in the Late Triassic compared to if they were all just the same animal?
It tells us more about how that ecosystem is structured.
Yeah.
So rather than having one animal that is basically dominating and the only thing you would see, what it tells us is there's going to be some partitioning of that environment between those different animals, maybe on the basis of different diets, or maybe they require slightly different habitats to live in, like different sorts of vegetation, or some nearer to water, some not. So it gives us a more nuanced and a slightly more complex view of what's going on rather than assuming it's all one thing. I think the reason why most of the dinosaurs from Zimbabwe of this type were called Massospondylus was because Massospondylus is very common in South Africa. A lot of these dinosaurs, when you only have bits and pieces of them, are quite similar to each other. It's very easy to think that these things look the same when you only have fragments of them. And also at the time that all of these things were called Massospondylus, there was much less work on these types of dinosaurs in particular. There weren't very many specialists on them around the world. And as a result, they were a bit neglected and were in need of people coming in to actually come and start sorting them out and working out what they were. So actually, there's a huge amount of isolated bits and pieces of sauropodomorph dinosaur from Zimbabwe in the Natural History Museum in Bulawayo, which is where most of their collections end up. And that material is all still needs people to go in and reevaluate it, given what we know 50 years after many of those specimens were collected, first of all, to make sure of what they really are. If they are Massospondylus, it's actually slightly interesting because it means that you've got the same dinosaur in Zimbabwe and South Africa, probably evidence that they might have been living at the same time, slightly different rocks from the ones that Musankwa comes from. And it would also make Massospondylus a very widespread dinosaur. Most dinosaurs are only known from like one hole in the ground. Whereas this might then be a dinosaur that's known over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of original range.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other possibility is it's an animal that's very closely related to Massospondylus, looks a lot like it, might be evolutionarily connected in some sense, but distinct from it. Maybe it's slightly different. So actually, a project I'm about to start with my Zimbabwean colleagues, due out there in January next year, is to start looking at that material and work out if it's really Massospondylus, or if it should be given a different name, or if it's something else altogether.
And what's the diagnostic part of a Massospondylus you want to find to compare them all against?
Neck bones.
Neck bones.
They have really weirdly long neck bones. So ideally you want a neck, but things like some of their shoulder bones and arm bones are also quite distinctive. So that's what we're looking for, really, to see if it has the same features. And also the other big problem was, although there's loads of Massospondylus in South Africa, is it really badly described. Like there wasn't a single big description of what Massospondylus really looks like or what characterizes it. So this is common with dinosaurs that were discovered or named decades ago, but often without a proper description. And then people think they know what it means, but without a proper description, it's hard to go back and really be sure what you're looking at. So one of the other key parts of this problem was working in South Africa on Massospondylus to work out what Massospondylus really was. And now we know what that is because we've done that work now. We can now go to other places and say, is this really the same as the South African stuff, or is it different? Mm-hmm. So we're now moving to that part of the project to work out if we're dealing with the same animal we know and love from our sites in South Africa, or if it's something slightly different. So that's a work in progress at the moment.
So one of the things that this is kind of like a compound question in a respect. We're in a late Triassic environment where the tectonic plates are separating. We're getting a separation between Laramidia and Gondwana, and obviously there must be some ground rumbling at the time. We've got a high diversity in the sauropodomorphs, or probably or possibly a high diversity. We know that the early Jurassic is poorly represented in the fossil record in a lot of respects. We know that there must have been a tremendously devastating End-Triassic extinction event that feels like, I've heard reported, based on volcanoes and a lot of problems like that, which I guess you would have if you were having continents drifting apart. Does a high sauropod diversity in Gondwana protect them? Is there a way, because it's a high diversity, is it more likely that a species might survive and lead to the provenance of sauropods later in the Jurassic? How is, I guess, that story related? The End-Triassic, the high diversity, the southern latitudes, did they come together to explain what happens by the Jurassic?
Yeah, so it's an interesting place to work on that question, because it's one of the few places in the world where we have late Triassic and early Jurassic rocks in the same places, with these rocks being laid down constantly through that era. So there are other places in the world where you can see a lot of late Triassic. There are other places in the world where you get a bit of early Jurassic, but there are very few that have that record that goes through the extinction. They're just a couple, really. And in South Africa, and Zimbabwe, it's probably the best record in the world for what's happening on land, like best continuous record for the changes on land. And what we do see is a number of changes. We see specific types of dinosaur disappearing during the late Triassic extinction event. But then actually what we see after that is we see an equally diverse set of similar dinosaurs re-evolving. So it's not like there's this although there is a big extinction for the dinosaurs, it's more like a turnover. So rather than going through like a big devastating, everything goes, and then they start to come back slowly, it seems to be that one set of characters shuffles off the stage and fairly quickly are replaced by another set of characters that come in and sort of doing the same kinds of jobs, but that are different. Mm-hmm. So they do, what we're not seeing, we're seeing evidence for a lot of turnover, but what we're not seeing is evidence for like a devastating drop in numbers from these things. And that might simply be because these types of dinosaurs are very good at very quickly re-evolving into these different types of jobs. It could be that maybe the southern continents were less badly affected by some of the other changes that happen in other parts of the world. We don't really know, is the honest answer. But it's an interesting window because the more we look and the more we document the types of animals and plants that are around before and afterwards, hopefully we can then start to narrow down some of those questions. Because we do know that a bunch of things just disappear forever, not so much dinosaurs, but various other kinds of reptile groups disappear forever. Whereas for some reason, dinosaurs don't do so badly during the End-Triassic extinction. Other groups of reptiles do really badly. So the phytosaurs we find in Zimbabwe in the Late Triassic, there are none of those in the early Jurassic. They're all gone. They're completely extinct all over the world. And it's not really clear still, and if anyone tells you they know the answer to this, they're making it up. But it's not really clear why dinosaurs come across that boundary relatively unaffected. As I said, there are extinctions because species go extinct, but groups don't become extinct. These things come in. And we don't know why, we still don't know why, dinosaurs seem sort of immune to the Late Triassic extinction, and whereas many other groups of reptiles just went. And that's still one of the big kind of mysteries in early dinosaur evolution. Why is it that dinosaurs did so well when so many other things did so badly? There are some possible reasons, but no one really knows the reasons. And some of the possible reasons are things like maybe dinosaurs were warm-blooded, maybe they were a bit more active or dynamic, or maybe their diets were a bit more varied or something like this. So there might be some ecological or biological reason, but these things are really difficult to test with fossils because unfortunately no one was there to actually watch them doing any of these things. So we have to try and come up with clever ways of seeing how dinosaurs might have been doing things differently from the other reptiles that were living alongside them that didn't fare so well.
I've heard a lot of descriptions of why certain dinosaurs do or survive or persist, and it's one of the ideas is the same when they talk about sharks and turtles. Is maybe it's just a really good shape. Maybe this form lends itself to survival, and we get turtles survive. Amphibians seem to survive. And there's a couple of them that they last, and there's something about it. And I've heard ideas like that. Maybe the Antarctic or some part of southern Gondwana offered some sort of bastion of safety away from where these plates were separating in the north or in the middle of Pangea. But you're right. Who knows?
I mean, it's a really interesting time because it's basically the beginnings of the modern world. So dinosaurs are a bit of an exception to this in one sense, in that obviously no non-bird dinosaurs are alive today, but the roots of birds, if you like, make it through that extinction. In terms of birds come later, I know, but also mammals make it through. Lizards probably probably originate before then and make it through. Various groups of modern amphibian probably evolving about then make it through. Various things on the crocodile line, turtle line, all these things. So all the things that we think about in terms of living vertebrate groups really get kick-started in the Late Triassic. And all of those groups have something coming through. And it's all the kind of other groups that were common up until that point that are the ones that get massacred. And these are groups that are less familiar to people because they're completely extinct groups with no living descendants. And including also things like the ancient forerunners of mammals, like the synapsids. Most of those animals also disappear at this time. So that there is a big turnover, and some of these groups get massively decimated. But weirdly, at the same time all of these things are suffering, the roots of the modern world are just starting to poke through at the same time, and they're getting through because they were there in the Triassic world, managed to get through this barrier, and then carry on, and then later on come to the sort of prominence that we come to expect later on in the Mesozoic, and then after the dinosaurs go extinct, even into the Cenozoic. So it's weird, although it's so far back, the Late Triassic is in some ways like the crucible of when the modern world started. It's when those groups get their first foothold.
Yeah, it's fascinating tracking the ripples or that butterfly effect where it's this change here or this moment. And it was fascinating to hear that you were mentioning how when you're looking at looking to date the Pebbly Arkose Formation that you find a lava layer on top that perhaps is related to all this.
Well, that layer is definitely associated with an extinction. So there are a bunch of extinctions at the end of the early Jurassic, but they're mainly documented well in marine fossils. And there are a bunch of pulses of volcanic activity about that time recorded in huge flood basalts in southern Africa in particular, that do seem to be, there seems to have been some kind of big global event at the end of the early Jurassic that those basalts were involved with. But it's very poorly understood in terms of its effect on animal life on land, but much better understood in terms of its possible effect on life in the oceans. So it's not really clear how much of an effect it had on land, because we have so few fossil formations from the early part of the middle Jurassic, immediately after these basalts are erupting. We can't really tell what the changes are, but there are changes, because it's things like when we get later in the Jurassic, we have proper sauropods, which are animals that were really, really rare before this happened, and the prosauropods go, and a bunch of other changes like that. So there's something big happens, but unfortunately it's like trying to work out what's going on at night while looking through sunglasses. It's actually a really obscure time of Earth history on land. It's very difficult to find places that give us that information.
It must be exciting to do the field work and wonder what you might find that's going to, raise the dimmer switch a little for you.
Yeah, that would be good. Or at least being able to take the sunglasses off for a little while would be useful. It's one of those parts of the world where we might get some ideas into what's going on in that, like, late, when dinosaurs are starting their rise to really take over.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're almost out of time, which is such a shame. Maybe I'll bring up this last little thing here. One of the things in the book is that Dr. Grant is a professor, and he's a field worker, and he does lectures, and he works very a lot of field work, and he doesn't really like doing the fundraising. There's a lot of elements of paleontology he doesn't like. He loves being out in the field and doing that work in the field. And we learned that Dr. Sattler is one of his students. And he's very protective, I think, of Dr. Sattler. In the novel, there is no romantic affiliations by any means, which is more alluded to in the films and in the different scripts. But one of the things that students do, you've supervised quite a few people in their way to getting their PhDs and things like that. I wanted to bring up a fun coincidence in some respects. It looks like, obviously, in 2023, you had the honor of having a dinosaur, the Vectipelta, given your name, which is kind of the Barrett eye, which is a nodosaur, which I thought was, what a wonderful animal to have named after you. But then I see that I think some of your students abolished the nodosaur clade in a paper later. So,
yeah, nodosauridae doesn't exist in that paper. But it's all right. Vectipelta still exists. It just means it's in a different family group from Nodosauridae. But that's, again, more work in progress, because there are differing opinions on how we classify these things. And so my student thought that old division of ankylosaurs and nodosaurs probably past its prime, needed looking at again. But there are still colleagues of mine who work on other armored dinosaurs that still think these are real things and are fighting to make sure they're still recognized. So this is one of those debates, not one of the ones that people are going to fight about probably in the pages of Science and Nature, but one where they're trying to work out exactly how those animals can be most sensibly divided up. And we'll see. These ideas always, like everything else, these ideas evolve through time. So eventually everyone will agree on something, I hope.
Well, in terms of dinosaurs, in terms of paleontology, from what I've discovered, is that there's always a new family that is you're getting shuffled into and out of, and certainly new families that are willing to take you. So that's it's been an interesting observation, nonetheless. Well, thank you so much for all of this time and sharing all your experiences. I've really appreciated it, and I've loved it. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for asking me on again. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. All right, a great big thank you to Paul Barrett for joining me on the show. He has a book coming out this October that you can pre-order on Amazon, I'm sure in other places too, called A History of Dinosaurs in 50 Fossils. It's a beautifully illustrated and definitive crash course on dinosaur fossils from Allosaurus. They use their teeth and jaws to dismember prey to the Sinosauropteryx specimen that confirm the existence of feathered dinosaurs. For natural history buffs and Jurassic Park fans, dinosaurs have captivated the world since Megalosaurus was the first one named in 1824, and A History of Dinosaurs in 50 Fossils features 50 of the most momentous dinosaur findings from the fossil record, from rare fossil embryos that provide a glimpse into the early stage of dinosaur growth and development to the claw of Deinonychus, the dinosaur that served as a template for Jurassic Park's terrorizing raptors. The book illustrates the enthralling evolutionary history of animals that ruled the Earth for more than 150 million years, with 75 full-color illustrations. Each stunning fossil paragraph, magnified for optimal detail, includes an entry explaining the importance of the discovery and the fossil significance in the larger evolutionary timeline. Themed chapters build off each other to depict a full and incredible story, including content on the origin and rise of dinosaurs, an introduction to major groups, biological characteristics like feeding behavior, distribution, and locomotion, and the first fossil birds, including the legendary feathered dinosaur Archaeopteryx. So the book provides insight on what fossils tell us about dinosaur relationships, movement, diet, skin, teeth, and frills, and so much more. History of Dinosaurs and 50 Fossils compiles centuries of the most exciting fossil findings that helped earn dinosaurs an enduring place in the public imagination. This authoritative and visually beautiful will delight and inspire readers young and old and help them understand the rise and fall of some of the most amazing creatures to roam Earth. So if you look it up, A History of Dinosaurs and 50 Fossils, you can find it. You can probably pre-order it if you're interested. It sounds awesome. All right, in today's episode, we're going to be meeting Dennis Nedry as part of our script review, and I thought, why not look a bit more closely at why Nedry jammed the phone lines, what it means to the story. Spoiler alert, we don't quite know why Nedry jammed the phones, and not being able to call for help becomes a lingering problem for the narrative. But let's review the texts before we get to my shrugging. So why did Nedry jam the phone lines? While Nedry's identity is still kept secret by Crichton, and Dodgson is speaking with his mysterious inside man during the chapter Airport, Dodgson reminds his source, quote, "We think the island maintains constant radio contact with InGen corporate headquarters in California, so," and he's interrupted. "Look, I got it covered," the man said. "Just relax and get the money ready. I want it all Sunday morning in San Jose Airport in cash." On page 71. Apparently Dodgson felt that this constant radio contact with headquarters was a concern, so Nedry took care of it. He jams the phone lines. And even after the park falls and John Arnold has to work overtime to get the systems back up and running, the phones don't come back. "Look," Arnold said, "the proof is right here." He pointed to the screens. "In less than an hour," he said, "the park will be back online. The only thing I've got left to clear is the telephones. For some reason, they're still out. But everything else will be working. And that's not theoretical, that's a fact." On page 248. Everything came back online but the phones, and this continues to cause troubles. As Grant enters the sauropod maintenance building, he opens a box and saw a telephone, but when he lifted the receiver, he heard only hissing static. Apparently, the phone lines weren't working yet, on page 251. And Nedry is to blame. He's done something that jams the phones good. Wu lifted one phone, heard hissing. Sounds like a modem. "But it's not," Arnold said, "because I went down into the basement and shut off all the modems. What you're hearing is just white noise that sounds like a modem transmitting." "So the phone lines are jammed?" "Basically, yes. Nedry jammed them very well. He's inserted some kind of a lockout into the program code, and now I can't find it because I gave that restore command which erased part of the program listings. But apparently the command to shut off the phones is still resident in the computer memory," we're told on page 255. So, Dodgson was worried about communicating with the mainland, and Nedry was too, so he jammed the phones very well. This impedes our heroes from calling the A and B to have them not deliver velociraptors to the mainland, but also keeps them from calling for a medevac for Ian Malcolm, who's desperate for proper medical care. So why does Nedry do this? Jamming these phone lines have to have been important to Nedry's heist. Nowhere in the novel does it say why, but we can perhaps deduce that reasonably, should someone have realized that Nedry had stolen the embryos, they would radio the mainland or headquarters and attempt to have someone intercept Dodgson's guy, who was on Dodgson's boat at the east dock, where Nedry was going to deliver the embryos, right? In this way, I suppose Nedry was going to have the phone lines jammed the entire weekend until the heist was complete, or something like that. It's not a crazy plan, but on the other hand, when they were complaining about all the phone lines being used, Nedry says, quote, "I'll clear a couple for you at the end of the next transmission in about 15 minutes. He yawned. "Looks like a long weekend for me. Guess I'll go get that Coke now." And he picked up his shoulder bag and headed for the door. "Don't touch my console, okay?" Now, page 173. In other words, he promised he'd unjam the phones after he commits his heist. I'm not entirely sure what role the jammed phones play in Nedry's scheme, but he's jammed them good. And it causes all kinds of troubles for our heroes. Now, once the phone lines are returned, our heroes have one task. That's to call for a doctor to save Malcolm's life. Gennaro, in fact, goes full lawyer, arguing, quote, "Look, there's a sick man over in that lodge. He needs a doctor or he'll die. You can't call for a doctor unless you have a phone. 4 people have probably died already. Now shut down and get the phones working," on page 256. Well, it's just the safety systems don't allow the computer to be shut down. Then turn the goddamn safety systems off. Can't you get it through your head? He's going to die unless he gets help. Full lawyer. Good for Gennaro. They turn the systems off and they get the phones back. But they don't come back immediately. But come back they do. So Gennaro picks up the phone and, quote, started to dial when he suddenly stopped. Uh-oh. Jesus, look at that, he said, and he pointed to one of the video monitors. But Arnold wasn't listening. He was staring at the map, where a tight cluster of dots by the lagoon had started to move in a coordinated way, moving fast in a kind of swirl. What's happening? Gennaro said. The duckbills, Arnold said tonelessly. They've stampeded. On page 258. Oh, Gennaro, you forgot you were phoning for a doctor. I guess Malcolm can wait. So all that happens in the chapter Dawn, which begins at 5 a.m. At dawn. They dump the system and restore manually. This is when they revert to backup power, which becomes a big problem in the novel, you'll recall. The phones are back shortly after 5 a.m., after the reset. By 8 a.m., we're at the chapter Aviary. John Arnold is using the phones, and he's communicating with Malcolm. And he's phoned him into the, where I guess Malcolm's in the lodge. And he's saying that they can't find Grant and the kids with the motion sensors or the video cameras yet, on page 276. More importantly, even though Gennaro forgot to call for a doctor, Arnold has now done it for him. Quote, all the park systems are back and functioning correctly. The phones are working. I've called for a doctor for you, says Arnold. Arnold speaking over the phone to Malcolm. So, Dateline, Jurassic Park. We can confirm on page 276 at 8 a.m. Arnold tells Malcolm that he has called for a doctor. But a doctor does not arrive until sundown. By page 369, in the chapter Under Control, it says, quote, 4 hours had passed after they'd stopped the ship from reaching the mainland, which was conclusively just a desperate breath away from 11 a.m., when the ship was going to reach Punta Arenas. So that makes this like 3 or 3:30 p.m., something like that. Quote, they had called authorities in San Jose for help. The Costa Rican National Guard was on its way, as well as an air ambulance to carry Malcolm to a hospital. But over the telephone, the Costa Rican Guard had been distinctly cautious. Undoubtedly, calls would go back and forth between San Jose and Washington before help was finally sent to the island, and now it was growing late in the day. If the helicopters did not arrive soon, they would have to wait until morning, we're told on page 369. So, they phoned at 8 a.m., and we know it's a 40-minute trip, as Hammond says on page 76, and we know from Prologue, Bite of the Raptor, InGen has helicopters that fly, quote, sick workers, back and forth to, when there's problems. It's just crazy. If Malcolm were as injured as he is, then an emergency vehicle wouldn't have been quicker to arrive. If anything, I would guess this is just a casualty of Crichton's imagination. He schemed up this telephone line issue that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it adds some drama to the story, which is great, because we like the drama in the story. We think the story is good. And then the resolution of the phone issue just seems to result in some wonky narrative stuff, but that's okay. That's the tale of the telephones. Not Crichton's greatest achievement in the novel, but an interesting one to look at more closely. And this week's text is the scene Subterfuge, which is scene 5 from the movie Jurassic Park. I don't like looking at the word subterfuge and not being able to pronounce that B in that word. I don't like that. I think that you should pronounce all the letters in a word sometimes. Here's a reading from the transcript. So the setting is a restaurant in San Jose, Costa Rica. Dennis Nedry is seated at a table. Lewis Dodson gets out of a taxi wearing a Panama hat and sunglasses, trying his best to look like a tourist. Nedry, seeing this, laughs and waves him over. Yo, Dodson! Waving him over. And Dodson sits at the table. You shouldn't use my name. Calling out, Dodson! Dodson! We got Dodson here! At the lack of a response, he says, see? Nobody cares. Nice hat. What, are you trying to look like a secret agent? And then Dodson puts a briefcase on the table, getting down to business. $750 on delivery, $50,000 more for each viable embryo. That's $1.5 million if you get all 15 species off the island. Oh, I'll get them. I'll get them all. Remember, viable embryos. They're no use to us if they don't survive. How am I supposed to transport them? Dodson puts a can of shaving cream on the table. The bottom screws open. Oh, that's great. Oh my God. It's cooled and compartmentalized inside. You guys, that's great. Customs can even check if they want to. Let me see. Go on. Nedry sprays shaving cream from the can onto his hand and grins, impressed. And Dodson says, there's enough coolant for 36 hours. No menthol? The embryos have to be back in San Jose by then. That's up to your guy on the boat. 7 o'clock tomorrow night on the East Dock. Make sure he gets it right. How are you planning to beat security? I've got an 18-minute window. 18 minutes, and your company catches up on 10 years of research. And then a waiter says, gracias, senor. A waiter puts a check for Nedry's meal on the table, and Nedry looks at it, and then at Dodson. Don't get cheap on me, Dodson. Now he awkwardly picks up the check and pulls out his wallet. That was Hammond's mistake. So in David Koepp, the screenwriter's first draft, he does it basically the same, but there's some, a bit more stage direction in what I've got here, but it's ultimately the same. So I'm not going to read the whole thing over again, but here are some interesting notes Dennis Nedry is in his late 30s, a big guy with a constant smile that could either be laughing with you or at you. You can never tell. And he sits at a table in front of a Central American cafe eating breakfast. And then there's a legend that says San Jose, Costa Rica. Nedry looks up and sees a man get out of a taxi. It's Lewis, Lewis, and then in parenthesis it says Louis. So he spells Lewis twice. Dodson, 50-ish, wearing a large straw hat, looking almost too much like an American tourist. Dodson clutches an attaché case close to him and scans the cafe furtively. Nedry laughs, shakes his head, and waves to him. Dodson! Then shortly Dodson is showing Nedry how the shaving can works. Dodson pulls an ordinary can of shaving cream from a shoulder bag he carries and sets it on the table. Dodson says, the bottom screw's open. It's cooled and compartmentalized. They can even check if they want. Press the top. And Nedry presses the top of the can, and real shaving cream comes out, and he grins impressed. While Dodson talks, Nedry looks around for somewhere to wipe the shaving cream and ends up dumping it on someone's jello on a dessert tray next to him. There's enough cooling gas for 36 hours. And that's really all that's very different from that scene. Or it's not even different, it's just another perspective on it. And now here's a reading from Malia Scotch-Marmo's draft, which you'll find very different. A purple sunset irradiates the exterior glass walls of a building. It's a high-tech building, Biogenetic Corporation headquarters at sunset. Interior, Biogen HQ. A peanut flies in the air and then falls into a big open mouth. Thump is the sound it makes. The mouth says, 500,000 is peanuts. He tosses another peanut and misses his open mouth. This is Dennis Nedry, a 40-year-old computer programmer. He's fat, with greasy hair and permanently wrinkled suit. His slovenly looks are wildly out of place on the rich leather sofa, where he reclines. Across the gleaming granite coffee table is Bill Baker, a businessman. A smooth, meticulous dresser, Baker is disgusted by Nedry's sloppy appearance and voracious consumption of food and drink. Nedry finishes a Coke. Over his shoulder is an impressive skyline view. Nedry says, I'm not reneging, I'm re-evaluating. Nedry holds the can of Coke upside down and drains the last drops. Nedry says, you think I'm a scumbag, I know. Nedry chuckles, lining up 3 peanuts on the table. One after the other, he throws them in the air, and he gulps down 2, misses one, and it skids across the glossy floor. Baker's head involuntarily cocks as he looks disgustedly at Nedry. Look, pal, you make a career in biogenetic industrial espionage, and you're bound to run into a scumbag or two. Guaranteed. Part of the job description. Look, who's to say who the real scumbag is? After all, I know what you guys need so bad. I heard of the reverse engineering. As Nedry continues, he shovels nuts into his mouth and chomps and speaks. Let the other guy put in all the work, all the R&D. You take the finished product, work backwards, breaking it down to reveal its genetic code. Presto! In a few measly months, you have know-how that took researchers 10 years to determine. You know how much Hammond has invested of his own personal wealth? Over $5 billion. And if you guys get the jump on him, in no time, the market's wide open. Nedry starts to laugh as he eats and talks. But boy, he's really got his product. Oh yes sirree, massive, gargantuan, money-making, never heard of profit like that product. It is a sight. Yes indeedy. Nedry laughs explosively. He begins to choke, and then he's coughing and gasping. Baker is repulsed. He stares out the window as the sun sets. Nedry, in true distress, clutches his own throat. He clumsily runs toward Baker, toppling chairs as he goes. Nedry grabs Baker's hand and squeezes it tightly, imploring Baker for help. Baker coolly shakes his hand loose and shoves Nedry to the floor. Baker looks down at the prone and desperate Nedry. Scumbag. We have a deal. That deal is not open to renegotiation, or even re-evaluation. Baker kneels down next to Nedry, who is beginning to turn blue. The deal stands. Take it or leave it. Baker glances at his watch. I'll give you a few minutes to decide. Nedry makes a superhuman effort to nod his head. Baker nods back and slams his fist into Nedry's solar plexus. It works. Nedry sucks in a huge gulp of air. He sits up, rubbing his belly as Baker leaves the room. Baker says, make sure the eggs are on the supply ship. Just make sure. Camera leaves Nedry and exits the window. It swish pans the concrete canyons of Wall Street and enters another office. Interior Conservative Law Office, daytime. Donald Gennaro, handsome, meticulously dressed, paces the high-polished, glassy corner suite. His boss, Ross, is seated. He's a powerful black man who waves a prosthetic arm. Ross says, we can't trust Hammond anymore. He's under too much pressure. There's the EPA, he's behind schedule, and the investors are getting nervous. There have been too many rumors, too many accidents. We can't screw around with this. Gennaro says, I've asked Hammond to arrange independent site inspections every week for the next 3 weeks. Ross says, what does he say? Gennaro says, insists nothing's wrong on the island. You know him. Do you believe him? No, I don't. I spent a lot of time with him 5 years ago when we raced the Capitol, and it's a wild ride. He's unpredictable, a dreamer. Potentially dangerous. We should never have gotten involved. What's our position? The firm owns 5%. General or limited? General. We should never have done that. Seemed wise at the time. We all wanted the park to happen. It was in lieu of fees. In any case, I agree. An inspection is overdue. Who are your site experts? Gennaro tosses a list on Ross's desk. He checks it out. Ross looks at it. Will they tell the truth? I think so. That guy Grant's a hot shot in his field, always goes his own way. Good. You're making all the arrangements? Hammond has to place the calls himself. I think he wants to pretend the park is not in trouble, that it's just a social invitation showing off the island. All right. Good. But let's be very clear about one thing. I don't know how bad this situation actually is, Donald, but if there's a problem on that island, don't be afraid to screw Hammond and burn Jurassic Park to the ground. Gennaro shakes hands awkwardly with Ross and leaves. Ross paces. Fed up, he whispers to himself, Costa Rica, my ass. Then he whacks his desk globe, sends it spinning, and the camera moves in on the spinning globe as we hear the rotor blades of a helicopter, which will dissolve cut into our next scene. All right, so let's check these scripts out. The first thing is that there's different locations. So let's start with the setting. In the film, Nedry and Dodson meet at a restaurant in San Jose, Costa Rica. In Kep's first draft, it's called a Central American Cafe, with a legend telling us that they're in San Jose, Costa Rica. And Malia Scotch-Marmo sets the meeting with Nedry in a high-tech building, Biogenetic Corporation's headquarters. That appears to be on Wall Street. So that would be, what, New York City? None of this is faithful to the novel, where Nedry and Dodson meet at a coffee shop in the departure building of the San Francisco airport, which we're told on page 69. Nedry isn't eating at a table, he's, quote, waiting at the counter. And that said, in the novel, it's implied that Nedry flies out of San Francisco to San Jose and connects with the rest of the inspection party, as said by the line, quote, they had picked up another passenger in San Jose, a man named Dennis Nedry, who had flown in to meet them, which we're told on page 76. Nedry rides in the helicopter to Isla Nublar with the inspection team, whereas in the film, he's just in the control room, working away by the time we meet him in Jurassic Park. He may as well have been, like, commuting to work when Dodson meets him in the movie, whereas he's part of the inspection team in the novel, as said by Gennaro on page 50. Quote, first group is a paleontologist, a paleobotanist, and a mathematician. They go down this weekend. I'll go with them. And who else? Just a technical person, the computer system analyst. Review the park's computers and fix some bugs. He should be there by Friday morning. In Scotch-Marmo's draft, we get a big departure from this meeting at the cafe. We're in the high-tech building Biogenetic Corporation headquarters at sunset. It has exterior glass walls. This resembles the visitor center, as described in Jurassic Park, which Crichton describes thusly. Quote, they met in the visitor building, 2 stories high, and all glass with exposed black anodized girders and supports. Grant found it determinedly high-tech on page 87. In any case, the visitor center at Jurassic Park is very much like Marmo's Biogenetic Corporation headquarters. It's supposed to look like it's from Silicon Valley, coded as high-tech, futuristic, and all glass, which was an en vogue look for that type of facility during the late 80s. That style of architecture was decidedly high-tech and Silicon Valley. Then we have Dr. Lewis Dodson. In the film, Dodson wears a Panama hat and sunglasses, trying to look like a tourist, and Nedry teases him. He appears frustrated and desperate with Nedry. Kep's Dodson has an alternate spelling for Lewis, L-E-W-I-S, which is L-O-U-I-S. Just in case, like I don't know why he added that. To be clear, Dodson is spelled L-E-W-I-S. And that was intentional by Crichton, because this name was created in homage to the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, who spells his pseudonym Lewis, L-E-W-I-S, but was born as Charles Ludwig. And can you guess his original birth last name? It's Dodson. Thus, Lewis Dodson is our villain here. How do I know Crichton did this? Because there are Alice in Wonderland references all over Jurassic Park. See the discussion section in episode 61, Descent, for a full breakdown. It's all there. Scotch-Marmo doesn't use Dr. Dodson, but instead invented Bill Baker. Across the gleaming granite coffee table is Bill Baker, a businessman, a smooth, meticulous dresser. Baker is disgusted by Nedry's sloppy appearance and voracious consumption of food and drink. We have Biosyn. In the film, and in Kep's first draft, I don't believe Biosyn is mentioned by name, and Scotch-Marmo's draft, the company is named Biogenetic Corporation. In this way, none of the scripts faithfully adapted the novel's villainous genetic Biosyn Corporation, as it's named on page 40. Now, because Biosyn and Dodson aren't as thoroughly fleshed out in the film or Kep's scripts, their motivations aren't as clear. Obviously, they're looking to, quote, catch up on, quote, 10 years of research by stealing biotech instead of developing it for themselves. But, quote, reverse engineering isn't mentioned, just like biosyn wasn't mentioned. In Scotch-Marmo's script, it's more clearly related, as Nedry is challenging Baker to renegotiate terms, where he says, I know what you guys need so bad. I've heard of reverse engineering. And he goes, you let the other guy put in all the work, all the R&D, you take the finished product, work backwards, breaking it down to reveal its genetic code. Presto, in a few measly months you have know-how that took researchers 10 years to determine. This is specifically Dodson's bread and butter at Biosyn, reverse engineering. Now, Dodson was the head of product development at Biosyn, which supposedly consisted of reverse engineering, taking a competitor's product, tearing it apart, learning how it worked, and then making your own version. In practice, it involved industrial espionage, much of it directed toward the InGen Corporation. On page 68, we're told, yes, genetically engineered animals can now be patented. The Supreme Court ruled on that in favor of Harvard in 1987. InGen will own its dinosaurs, and no one else can legally make them. What prevents us from creating our own dinosaurs, someone said. Nothing except that they have a 5-year head start. It would be almost impossible to catch up before the end of the century. He paused. Of course, if we could obtain examples of their dinosaurs, we could reverse engineer them, make them our own, with enough modifications in the DNA to evade their patents. Can we obtain examples of their dinosaurs? Dodson paused. I believe we can, yes. So they're not catching up on 10 years of research. They're overcoming a 5-year head start, we're told on page 68. And as for Hammond personally investing $5 billion of his own personal wealth, that's balderdash. I mean, if Hammond already had $5 billion of personal wealth, what does he care to do anything risky for the purposes of profits? And if Hammond put in $5 billion of his personal wealth, what investors are threatening to pull out, making this safety inspection necessary? Obviously, this element of the script was unfit for publication, right? In the novel, it sounds ridiculous to say more modest, but the fundraising campaign was way less than $5 billion. Frankly, stealing $750,000 from Hammond's personal $5 billion investment doesn't even sound that bad. Who'd even care? Do you know what percent of $5,750,000 is? It rounds up to 0%. It's nothing. So obviously that's not what's in the novel. In the novel, we get, quote, with Gennaro's help, Hammond got his money. Between September of 1983 and November of 1985, John Alfred Hammond and his pachyderm portfolio raised $870 million in venture capital to finance his proposed corporation, International Genetic Technologies, Inc. And they could have raised more, except Hammond insisted on absolute secrecy, and he offered no return on capital for at least 5 years. That scared a lot of investors off. In the end, they had to take mostly Japanese consortia. On page 60. $1 million compared to $870 million investment is also a pittance, literally 1 out of 870, but that's not $5 billion. It's like numbers don't mean anything anymore once you start talking about multiple billions. They're just too incomprehensible. Where might Scotch-Marmo have gotten the idea for $5 billion? Well, actually, that figure is in the novel, in the chapter with Nedry and Dodson meeting. Bioengineered DNA was weight for weight the most valuable material in the world. A single microscopic bacterium too small to see with the naked eye, but containing the genes for a heart attack enzyme. Streptokinase for ice minus, which prevented frost damage to crops, might be worth $5 billion to the right buyer, we're told on page 69. So there you go. $5 billion, that's in the novel. It just doesn't have anything to do with the heist, the embryos, the park, InGen, or anything like that. It's a hypothetical value if you could find the, quote, right buyer, hypothetically. All right, Nedry. In the film, Nedry is performed by Wayne Knight, who was born in 1955, so he's about 37 or 38, depending on when the scene was filmed, and that's what you get in Kep's first draft 2. In his late 30s, a big guy with a constant smile that's either laughing with you or at you, you never can tell. I have never heard a soul say that Knight didn't play Nedry to an absolute T. In the novel, Nedry isn't described at the first meeting because his identity is steeped in secrecy, known only as Dodson's inside man on page 69. But when we do meet him by page 76, he's said to be, quote, fat and sloppy, eating a candy bar, and there was sticky chocolate on his fingers and flecks of aluminum foil on his shirt. Nedry had mumbled something about doing computers on the island and hadn't offered to shake hands. Scotch-Marmo writes Nedry as a, quote, 40-year-old computer programmer. He's fat with greasy hair and permanently wrinkled suit. The novel doesn't give us Nedry's age, although his face is described as boyish on page 273, after he's been scavenged by the compies. That doesn't really jive with late 30s or 40 years old, but it's hard to nail down how old he is in the novel. Consider this observation from Tim during the tour, who describes Nedry as a, quote, fat college kid who had something to do with computers on page 93. So he's described as boyish and a college kid. Neither imply he's 40 years old. That's what the novel gives us in any case. The fun scene where Dodson is in disguise and Nedry is teasing him about it is more fantastic in the final version that made it to the screen, and it remains unchanged in Kep's 2 passes at his script, and this is authentic to the novel too. "You're late, pal," the man said. He looked at the straw hat Dodson was wearing and laughed. "What is this supposed to be, a disguise?" On page 69. Nedry says Dodson's name a bunch of times, and it's funny. And this correlates with Nedry's backup plan. Nedry'd been damned careful, even to the point of making Dodson meet him in the San Francisco airport at the last minute with an excuse about wanting to see the money. Actually, Nedry wanted to record his conversation with Dodson and mention him by name on tape, just so that Dodson wouldn't forget he owed the rest of the money. Nedry was including a copy of the tape with the embryos. In short, Nedry had thought of everything on page 134. And this plays out in the novel less dramatically. "Hell no, Dodson," the man said. "I want to see the damn money." "Okay, fine." The man turned away, drank his coffee. "That's fine, Dr. Dodson," page 69. So he uses his name over and over so that he can incriminate him if necessary. And then they go over the plan, stealing embryos with the shaving cream canister. In the film, Dodson gives Nedry $750,000 and an additional $50,000 more for each viable embryo, totaling $1.5 million for stealing all 15 species from Jurassic Park. The bottom screws from the bottom of what's visibly a Barbasol brand shaving product. It's cooled and compartmentalized inside and gives Nedry the frickin' giggles. He loves this thing and jokes that it's not menthol. It has enough coolant for 36 hours, and we learned that Nedry aims to get this to Dodson's, quote, guy on the boat, where he'll have it for him at 7 o'clock Saturday night at the East Dock. Quote, make sure he gets it right. In Kep's first draft, it's all the same, except when Nedry goes to wipe the shaving cream from his hand, he ends up dumping it on someone's jello on a dessert tray next to him. So it wasn't his pie, it was someone else's jello. This is still a monstrous thing to do with shaving cream. In the novel, Nedry wipes the foam on the edge of his plate, on page 70. In Scotch-Marmo's draft, they don't go over the plan. And her draft doesn't include the shaving cream canister, but it mentions that Nedry doesn't want to do the job for $500,000. So Nedry is being paid significantly less for his work than in Kep's script. In the novel, Nedry is set to make $1.5 million, just as Kep has said. We're reminded on page 134, quote, his plan was going to make him $1.5 million, 1.5 meg. That was 10 years of income in a single tax-free shot. It was going to change his life. And the shaving product is a large can of Gillette Foamy shaving cream on page 70, not a Barbasol product. It's said to be, quote, a little heavier than usual, and Dodson's technical team had been, quote, assembling it around the clock for the last 2 days. In the novel, there are 15 species for Nedry to steal the embryos for. That is the same. $50,000 more for each viable embryo, totaling $1.5 million for stealing all 15 species from Jurassic Park. Of course, $50,000 multiplied by 15 species equates to $750,000, which is the second half of the $1.5 million that they agreed upon. This suggests that there are going to be only 15 embryos which Nedry is to steal for Kep's script. However, in the novel, as related on page 175 and 76, the embryos were arranged by species: Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Hadrosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, each embryo in a thin glass container wrapped in silver foil, stoppered with polyline. Nedry quickly took 2 of each, slipping them into the shaving cream can. Then he screwed the base of the can shut and twisted the top. There was a hiss of releasing gas inside, and the can frosted in his hands. Dodson had said there was enough coolant to last 36 hours, more than enough time to get back to San Jose. This clearly indicates that Nedry steals 2 of each embryo, thus 30 embryos. He was paid for each viable species, but not each viable embryo. This is just a technicality between the script and the novel. For all intents and purposes, they're meaning the same thing. I'm just being very thorough. And the coolant lasts 36 hours. That is consistent with the novel as well. Then this idea of renegotiating. Nedry almost suggests that they renegotiate the terms in the novel. Let's just review the bidding, he says on page 70. The deal is the same, Dodson said. $50,000 on delivery of each embryo. If they're viable, an additional $50,000 each on page 71. This may not necessarily be renegotiating terms, as opposed to Nedry just capturing Dodson on tape with all the details about their heist scheme, for the purposes of keeping Dodson honest, should he not want to pay the full amount later. In Scotch-Marmo's script, renegotiating the terms was adapted into a serious point of contention. Nedry knows Baker needs him to get way ahead, so he looks to leverage more money from him. Baker implies that he'd rather let Nedry die than renegotiate terms, and so they agree with their arrangements. The East Dock. In the film and in Kep's first draft, the embryos are to be delivered to Dodson's other insider at the East Dock at 7 p.m. Quote, make sure he's got it right. This somehow implies that there are other docks or other boats, or there's something that could be misunderstood, and Nedry needs this other guy to, quote, get it right. In the novel, he says the same. Just make sure you have the boat waiting at the east dock of the island Friday night, not the north dock, where the big supply boats arrive. The east dock, it's a small utility dock. You got that? On page 71. Here there's a bit more clarity. Oh, there are 2 docks, and this guy better be at the correct one. It's implied that Dodson's guy has his own boat, too, as Nedry thinks on page 176, quote, because if Dodson's boat wasn't waiting for him at the east dock when Nedry got there, the whole plan would be ruined, which basically outlines this is a boat of Dodson's, not the NB, not a supply boat, and not a client of Jurassic Park, but Dodson. Beating security. How is Nedry's plan to work? There are a few more details described in the scene too. So Lewis Dodson says, how are you planning to beat security? And Nedry says, oh, I've got an 18-minute window, 18 minutes, and your company catches up on 10 years of research. So that was the plan. It should take only 18 minutes. The novel doesn't explicitly say how long the plan was expected to take. Nedry swipes the embryos in less than 2 minutes. On page 176, the drive to the east dock was to only take 3 minutes, and 3 minutes back to the control room. That's only like 10 minutes. And so, a 15 to 18 minute window is probably adapted from what Crichton envisioned, but Nedry's plan wasn't detailed in the novel that clearly. Finally, an easily overlooked moment in the film, especially on your first pass, was Nedry revealing his motivations as to why he's assisting Dodson with corporate espionage. A waiter puts the check for Nedry's meal on the table. Nedry looks at it, and then at Dodson. Don't get cheap on me, Dodson. That was Hammond's mistake. You see, Hammond got cheap on Nedry, and so Nedry is going to make him pay. In Scotch-Marmo's script, Nedry just wants more money. He sees an opportunity to leverage more money from Baker's company, and figures he'll try and extort them. And why not? They're talking figures that reach into the multi-billions. But no deal, Nedry, you slob. In the novel, Nedry is far more sympathetically written. He isn't being greedy. He isn't looking to snag more money. He's trying to get even. On page 175, Nedry was annoyed with the Jurassic Park project. Late in the schedule, InGen had demanded extensive modifications to the system but hadn't been willing to pay for them, arguing that they should be included under the original contract. Lawsuits were threatened. Letters were written to Nedry's other clients, implying that Nedry was unreliable. It was blackmail, and in the end Nedry had been forced to eat his overages on Jurassic Park and make the changes that Hammond wanted. To recap, InGen hired Nedry, but didn't give him very good parameters on what he was building a system for because they wanted to be very secretive about it. In the novel, when he received the parameters that InGen was looking for, he was so astonished and confused that he called his friend Barney Fellows to try and make sense of it all. Here's from page 103. A couple of years earlier, when InGen had hired Nedry to design the park control systems, one of the initial design parameters called for data records with 3 by 10 to the exponent 9 fields. Nedry just assumed that it was a mistake and had called Palo Alto to verify it, but they had told him the spec was correct. 3 billion fields. Nedry had worked on a lot of large systems. He'd made a name for himself setting up worldwide telephone communications for multinational corporations. Often those systems had millions of records. He was used to that, but InGen wanted something so much larger. Puzzled, Nedry had gone to see Barney Fellows over at Symbolics near MIT campus in Cambridge. What kind of database has 3 billion records, Barney? Well, my guess is they're doing something with DNA, Barney said. What's the system? Multi-XMP. Multi-XMP? You mean more than one Cray? Wow. Barney was frowning now, thinking that one over. Can you tell me anything else? Sorry, Nedry said, I can't. And he had gone back and designed the control systems. It had taken him and his programming team more than a year, and it was especially difficult because the company would never tell him what the subsystems were for. The instructions were simply, design a module for record keeping, or design a module for visual display. They gave him design parameters, but no details about use. He had been working in the dark, and now that the system was up and running, he wasn't surprised to learn there were bugs. What did they expect? And they'd ordered him down here in a panic, all hot and bothered about his bugs. And as for the blackmail and letters to his other clients saying he was unreliable, Hammond shares his thoughts on that subject too. Quote, Nedry's a genius in his own way, but we had to press him quite hard toward the end to make sure he got things right, says Hammond on page 199. So, Hammond was just doing business and pressing hard. In any case, it reads as if Nedry and his company, Integrated Computer Systems, Inc., were losing money on the project, being, quote, forced to eat his overages, and at the same time, InGen was threatening to ruin his reputation with other clients, or in other words, his potential to do business in the future. I don't see Nedry as a greedy monster looking to get rich, but rather another of Hammond's victims, who's looking to just get back to even so he can move on. That said, his thoughts describing the money from Dodson as, quote, 10 years of income in a single tax-free shot, and it was going to change his life, does argue otherwise. He's getting bonus money. No, he's not getting even. In any case, it's not just for the money, is what I'm saying. But the money's still really good all the same. Dodson's inside man's secret identity. The truth is, the subterfuge isn't really fully realized, and at no point does Nedry's secret identity truly provide any drama, suspense, tension, or higher stakes. There is some misdirect that perhaps Malcolm is the obnoxious and arrogant briefcase-carrying man inside man who's openly no friend of Hammond's, but again, that's not played for drama or tension either. The misdirect and secrecy of the inside man is simply not developed to best effect. There is nothing really gained by hiding Nedry's identity in the novel. Like even in Dune, we're told in the very, very early chapters in a quote that precedes one of the chapters, "Yui, Yui, Yui," goes the refrain. "A million deaths were not enough for Yui," from A Child's History of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irula. Basically, from the beginning of the novel, you know that Yui and a million deaths are related. And I read this as Yui was responsible for the deaths of all the freemen, and that was true. Though his motivations are revealed to be far more complicated and sad than I imagined, and that was cool too. I looked into this quote, and it appears that there appear to be two readings of it. Either even a million deaths would not be enough to punish Yui for his treachery, or he's so bloodthirsty even a million deaths aren't enough for him, he wants more. But in either reading, you know that Yui is going to betray his people. And believe me, knowing that he's destined to do something truly horrifying, as in the Book of Legend, written by the Princess Irula, quotes the chanting masses, "Yui, Yui, Yui," goes the refrain, "A million deaths were not enough for Yui." You know this dude does something, and it adds tremendous suspense and tension to every scene that he's in. So perhaps Jurassic Park may have benefited from revealing the inside man's identity, if you believe Frank Herbert knows anything about science fiction anyhow. Nedry isn't confirmed as Dodson's inside man until page 175, 100 pages later, in a middling throwaway line after he's already halfway through the embryo heist. Quote, "But later, when he was approached by Lewis Dodson at BIOS, and Nedry was ready to listen, and able to say that he could indeed get past Jurassic Park security. He could get into any room, any system, anywhere in the park because he had programmed it that way, just in case." So I think, opportunity missed. But we still love the book, so maybe it was just fun the way it is. Meeting Gennaro. A big part of Scotch-Marmo's script is meeting Gennaro in this scene, which we did in episode 67, The Encased Mosquito, earlier, if you want to go check that out. In any case, we meet Gennaro, and he's in a conservative law office where Donald Gennaro is a handsome, meticulously dressed man. Kep described Gennaro as a 40-year-old with a $100 haircut, and Crichton describes him in the novel as a stocky, muscular man in his mid-30s wearing an Armani suit and wire-frame glasses. Gennaro is meeting with Ross, a powerful black man with a prosthetic arm. This is Daniel Ross from the San Francisco law offices of Cowan, Swain, and Ross, who is said to look as, quote, cold as an undertaker in his dark pinstripe suit, on page 49. Much of the dialogue in this scene is very closely adapted from the novel, and rightly so. The entire impetus of the safety inspection relies on this law firm's motivation. So, Scotch-Marmo is looking to keep this as straight as possible. Ross says, "We can't trust Hammond anymore. He's under too much pressure. There's the EPA, he's behind schedule, and the investors are getting nervous. There have been too many rumors, too many accidents. We can't screw around with this." Compare that to the novel, quote, "We can't trust Hammond anymore. He's under too much pressure. The EPA is investigating him. He's behind schedule on his Costa Rican resort, and the investors are getting nervous. There have been too many rumors of problems down there. Too many workmen have died, and now this business about living procompsat whatever on the mainland. Procompsat-Nathis subplot that drives the narrative for the first 70 pages of the novel, that isn't mentioned in Marmo's script. Or any script, really. Gennaro says, "I've asked Hammond to arrange independent site inspections every week for the next 3 weeks. What does he say? Insists nothing is wrong on the island. You know him. Do you believe him?" Gennaro says, "In the novel, we can't screw around with this. We've got to inspect that island right away. I've asked Hammond to arrange independent site inspections every week for the next 3 weeks. What does Hammond say? He insists nothing is wrong on the island. Claims he has all these security precautions. But you don't believe him," Ross said. "No," Gennaro said, "I don't." So that's a little different, but relates the same message. And then Scotch-Marmo continues agreeing with Crichton almost all the way to the end here. "No, I don't. I spent a lot of time with him 5 years ago when we raised the capital. It was a wild ride. He's unpredictable, a dreamer, potentially dangerous. We should never have gotten involved. What's our position? Firm owns 5%. General or limited? General. We should never have done that. Seemed wise at the time. We all wanted the park to happen. It was in lieu of fees. In any case, I agree an inspection is overdue. Who are your site experts?" And Gennaro tosses a list on Ross's desk to check out, and Ross wonders, will they tell the truth? Again, all tremendously similar to Crichton, if not verbatim for most of it. "Hammond's a dreamer," Gennaro said. "A potentially dangerous dreamer," Ross said. "We should never have gotten involved. What is our financial position?" "The firm," Gennaro said, "owns 5%. General or limited?" "General." Ross shook his head. "We should never have done that." "It seemed wise at the time," Gennaro said. "Hell, it was 8 years ago. We took it in lieu of some fees. And if you remember, Hammond's plan was extremely speculative. He was really pushing the envelope. Nobody really thought he could pull it off. But apparently he has, Ross said. In any case, I agree that an inspection is overdue. What about your site experts? I'm starting with the experts Hammond already hired as consultants early in the project. Gennaro tossed a list on Ross's desk. First group is a paleontologist, a paleobotanist, and a mathematician. They go down this weekend, and I'll go with them. Will they tell you the truth? Ross said. Now, in the novel, there's much more backstory on Gennaro's role in helping Hammond raise money with the Pachyderm portfolio, which recall from earlier was said to be $870 million. The firm accepts general stock options to the tune of 5% in lieu of fees, and 5% of $870 million is $43 million. That's not a bad payday for them, I guess. Back to Scotch-Marmo's script. Gennaro says, I think so. That guy Grant's a hotshot in his field, always goes his own way. Good. You're making all the arrangements? Hammond has to place the calls himself. I think he wants to pretend the park is not in trouble. That it's just a social invitation showing off the island. Again, Crichton's novel says the same thing. He just adds like a little bit more detail. I think so. None of them had much to do with the island, and one of them, the mathematician Ian Malcolm, was openly hostile to the project from the start. Insisted it would never work. Could never work. And who else? Just a technical person. Computer system analyst. Review the park computers and fix some bugs. He should be there by Friday morning. Fine, Ross said. You're making the arrangements? Hammond has to place the calls himself. I think he wants to pretend he's not in trouble, that it's just a social invitation, showing off his island. All right, Ross said. Just make sure it happens. Stay on top of it. I want this Costa Rican situation resolved within a week. Ross got up and walked out of the room. Ultimately, the big differences between Scotch-Marmo's script and Crichton's story is the omission of the Procompsognathus bites, remains, X-rays, escapes, etc. There are no copies in the script. This is all taken from a chapter Calvin Swain and Ross, but the conclusion of the scene is adapted from the chapter Hammond on page 58. Ross says, all right, good, but let's be very clear about one thing. I don't know how bad this situation actually is, Donald, but if there's a problem on that island, don't be afraid to screw Hammond and burn Jurassic Park to the ground. Gennaro shakes hands awkwardly with Ross and leaves. Ross paces, fed up, and he whispers to himself, Costa Rica my ass. Then he whacks a desk globe and sends it spinning. In the novel, it's similar, but like I said, from a different chapter. Gennaro walked down the hallway tearing the sales tags off his suitcase. As he passed the all-glass conference room, Dan Ross left the table and came outside. Have a good trip, Ross said. But let's be very clear about one thing. I don't know how bad this situation actually is, Donald, but if there's a problem on that island, burn it to the ground. Jesus, Dan, we're talking about a big investment. Don't hesitate. Don't think about it. Just do it. Hear me? Gennaro nodded. I hear you, he said. But Hammond? Screw Hammond, Ross said. Ross is willing to light that $43 million of their general stock all up to get out of bed with Hammond. Those are Gennaro's marching orders. Screw Hammond. Because the general stock means they're not covered in the event of a lawsuit, and Ross believes the island is so risky and unsafe that they'd lose money. Read, they'll be held liable for greater than $43 million in expenses and penalties. So get out while the getting's good. And so there's a review of that scene, all the details that come from the novel, and how they further inform our view of the movie. Some of the interesting things that other versions of the script were focusing on. All right, a big thank you to Dr. Barrett for coming on the show. It was wonderful having you on. I just love being able to ask all these questions about being in the field and doing the work and things like that. It's just a wonderful world for me to imagine, I guess. I want to sign off today thanking you for joining me. If you want to read along in the book, add some thoughts to what we've been discussing on the show, or be a guest on the show and chat with me about anything you like about Jurassic Park, you can do that by connecting with me. I'm at ryansrogers@gmail.com, and if you'd like to be a guest, drop me a line and we can try and set something up. We can rehash, tear down, gush over, and chit-chat about any part of the book, or also not the book, all you'd like. Jurassic Park-Cast is part of the Spring Chicken's banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chicken's Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. You can find links to all that baggage in the show notes, or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com, and you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, or on X at RogersRyan22. Thank you dearly for tuning into the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where we talk about the novel Jurassic Park, and also not that too. Until next time.